The Weevils came in August, when the Kansas heat hung over the land like a curse, and the grain bins of Harrowfield sat fat and full from a harvest that had promised prosperity. They came silently, invisibly, carried perhaps on a shipment of seed corn from Missouri, or hidden in the wooden slats of a freight wagon that had traveled from infested territory to the south. No one saw them arrive. No one knew they were there until the damage was already done, until the wheat that families had labored all summer to grow and thresh and store began to move with a life of its own, crawling with the small brown bodies of insects that devoured everything they touched. By September, the grain merchant Aldous Pritchard opened his storehouse and found not wheat, but dust. 40,000 pounds of grain, representing the harvest of a dozen farms, had been reduced to hollow husks and weevil castings. The insects had eaten the hearts of the kernels, leaving behind shells that crumbled at a touch. Pritchard stood in the doorway of his warehouse, watching the ruined grain shift and settle, and understood that he was looking at starvation. The infestation spread through Harrowfield like fire through dry grass. Every barn, every granary, every root cellar where families had stored their winter provisions fell to the Weevils. The Hoffman farm lost 8,000 pounds of wheat in a single week. The Lundgren place, which had boasted the largest harvest in the county, found their grain bin crawling with larvae by mid-September. The Murphy family, the Schofields, the Jansens. One by one, the farms of Harrowfield watched their food supply transform into insect nurseries. The panic began in October when the full scope of the disaster became clear. There was no grain to plant in the spring. There was no grain to eat through the winter. There was no grain to sell for the cash that would buy the provisions that might replace what the Weevils had taken. Harrowfield was facing a famine born not of drought or flood or pestilence of the fields, but of tiny insects no bigger than a grain of rice, insects that had found their way into every storehouse in the settlement, every storehouse except one. 3 miles east of town, on a rise overlooking the Smoky Hill River, Edmund Vickers descended the ladder into his grain silo and held his lantern high. The wheat glowed golden in the light, clean and dry and utterly untouched. 12,000 pounds of it, stored in a structure that the people of Harrowfield had mocked for 3 years as the most absurd building in Kansas. He scooped a handful from the nearest bin and let it run through his fingers, watching for any sign of movement, any hint of the infestation that had destroyed his neighbors. Nothing. The grain was perfect. Edmund closed his fist around the wheat and allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. They had called him a fool. They had called his silo a monument to paranoia. They had laughed at his methods, his precautions, his insistence on building something far larger and far more elaborate than a single farmer could ever need. Now his silo held the only edible grain for 20 miles in any direction. He climbed back up the ladder into the autumn sunshine and looked west toward the town that had ridiculed him. They would come soon. When the hunger set in, when the children began to cry for bread that did not exist, when the proud men who had mocked his preparations found themselves with nothing, they would remember the fool on the hill, and Edmund Vickers would feed them. Because that was what the grain was for. He had come to Kansas in the spring of 1882, a man of 37 with a miller's education and a farmer's ambition. His father, Cornelius Vickers, had operated a grain mill in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, for 40 years, and Edmund had grown up surrounded by the science and art of storing grain. He knew wheat the way a jeweler knows diamonds, its qualities, its vulnerabilities, its enemies. Chief among those enemies were the insects that infested poorly stored grain, turning abundance into waste. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. Whether you're in grain country, the river valleys, or somewhere the harvest matters just as much, these lessons of frontier wisdom are timeless. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss what happens when the Weevils arrive and every other store falls. His father had taught him the old methods, techniques developed over centuries in Europe and refined in America, passed down from miller to miller like sacred knowledge. Grain must be dried thoroughly before storage because moisture bred mold and mold attracted insects. Storage structures must be sealed tight because weevils entered through cracks no wider than a hair. Walls must be treated with lime wash, which killed larvae and repelled adult insects. Floors must be elevated above the earth, preventing ground moisture from rising into the grain. And the structure itself should be built of cedar when possible, because cedar oil was a natural deterrent that insects avoided. These methods were not secrets. They were common knowledge among professional millers and grain merchants who had learned their trade properly. But they were expensive, time-consuming, and largely unknown to the farmers of the frontier, who stored their grain in whatever structures they could build, quickly and cheaply. Wooden bins with gaps in the planking, earthen cellars that stayed damp year-round, barns shared with livestock whose feed attracted vermin of every kind. Edmund had seen what happened when grain was stored carelessly. In the summer of 1878, a weevil infestation had destroyed half the stored wheat in Lancaster County, including several thousand pounds that had been entrusted to his father's mill by neighboring farmers. The mill had survived. Cornelius Vickers knew his craft, but the farms that had stored grain in their own inadequate facilities had lost everything. Edmund had watched families go hungry that winter, had seen children grow thin on a diet of what could be scrounged and begged, had understood in the most visceral way possible that grain storage was not a matter of convenience, but of survival. When he came to Kansas, he brought that knowledge with him. His claim was 160 acres of good bottomland along the Smoky Hill River, with a gentle rise at its center where a building could be placed above the spring floods. He paid the filing fee, built a modest sod house for himself, and began planning the structure that would become his obsession. The silo took 2 years to build. He started with the foundation, a raised platform of limestone blocks, quarried from an outcropping 3 miles distant and hauled to the site by his buckskin gelding, Barley. The platform stood 3 feet above the ground, high enough to prevent any ground moisture from reaching the storage bins above, high enough to discourage the burrowing rodents that might otherwise gnaw their way in from below. The walls were double-layered. The outer wall was standard lumber, sturdy and weather-tight. The inner wall was cedar, purchased at considerable expense from a lumber dealer in Salina who thought Edmund was building a rich man's mansion and charged accordingly. Between the 2 walls, Edmund packed a mixture of dried clay and cedar shavings, creating an insulating barrier that maintained a stable temperature year-round and added another layer of protection against insects. The interior surfaces were lime-washed twice yearly, a caustic coating that killed any larvae that might hatch and deterred adult insects from laying eggs. The floor was lined with sheet tin, sealed at every seam with pine tar, creating an impermeable barrier that no weevil could penetrate. The bins themselves were built with tight-fitting lids and ventilation ports that could be opened or closed to regulate airflow. and the capacity was enormous. Edmund built storage for 50,000 pounds of grain, enough to feed a community of 50 people for a year, or to supply seed for 100 farms. For a single man farming 160 acres, it was absurdly, laughably excessive. The people of Harrowfield noticed. If you are enjoying this story, hit that hype button right now. It's free, takes a second, and helps this video reach more people who need to see it. Now, back to the story. Aldous Pritchard was the first to comment publicly. Pritchard was the grain merchant who served the Harrowfield settlement, buying farmers' harvests at wholesale prices and selling provisions on credit against future crops. He was a lean, calculating man who had built his business on the simple principle that farmers needed him more than he needed them. A man like Edmund Vickers, who stored his own grain in a structure that rivaled Pritchard's own warehouse, was a threat to that principle. The Pennsylvania man is building himself a cathedral, Pritchard announced at his store, where farmers gathered to conduct business and exchange gossip. A grain cathedral, 50,000 pounds of capacity, for a farm that produces 3,000 pounds in a good year. The man means to store grain for the entire county. Or perhaps he's planning for the second coming and wants to be ready. The laughter was immediate and sustained. Edmund's silo became the favorite joke of Harrowfield, a monument to Eastern foolishness, proof that book learning was no substitute for practical frontier sense. Mayor Orrin Jessup, a round, jovial man who owed his position largely to his ability to agree with whoever was speaking, visited the construction site in the summer of 1883. He walked around the rising structure, examined the limestone foundation, peered at the cedar planking, and shook his head in wonderment. "Mr. Vickers," he said, "I have to ask, what in heaven's name do you intend to do with all this space? You could store grain for half the territory in here." "That's the idea," Edmund replied. Jessup waited for an explanation. When none came, he tried again. "But why? You're a single man. You farm alone. Even in your best year, you won't fill a quarter of this building." "The space isn't for my grain alone," Edmund said. "It's for whoever needs it." Jessup stared at him. "You mean to store other people's grain? For a fee?" "For safety. My methods prevent infestation. The structures in this settlement do not. Sooner or later, the Weevils will come. When they do, the grain stored here will survive. The grain stored elsewhere may not." The mayor's jovial expression flickered, replaced briefly by something that might have been unease. Then he laughed, clapping Edmund on the shoulder. "Weevils! The man is worried about weevils. My friend, we've been farming this land for 15 years. We know how to store grain. We don't need a Pennsylvania miller to teach us our business." He reported the conversation to Pritchard, who spread it throughout the settlement with embellishments. The fool on the hill thought the farmers of Kansas didn't know how to store grain. The Easterner, with his fancy silo, was going to save them all from weevils. The mockery intensified. Edmund said nothing. He finished his silo, filled it with his own modest harvest, and waited. If Wild West Retribution has become part of your week, consider joining the channel membership. Just a couple dollars a month keeps these stories coming. Links below, and hit that hype button if you haven't already. Now, back to the story. For 3 years, the silo sat mostly empty. Edmund's farm produced well enough, 3,000 to 4,000 pounds of wheat annually, enough to sustain himself and barley with plenty left over for sale. He stored it all in his cedar-lined bins, lime-washed and sealed, and watched it remain pristine while the months passed. Each year, he offered his storage services to his neighbors. Each year, they declined, politely or otherwise. Pritchard had made it known that farmers who used Vickers's silo would find their credit at his store suddenly restricted. The social pressure was effective. No one wanted to be associated with the fool on the hill, the man who had built a grain cathedral for an invisible threat. The harvest of 1885 was the best Harrowfield had ever seen. The rains came at the right times, the sun shone when it was needed, and the wheat grew tall and golden across every farm in the settlement. Pritchard's warehouse overflowed. Barns that had never been meant for grain storage were pressed into service. Root cellars were filled to capacity. The farmers of Harrowfield congratulated themselves on their prosperity and looked forward to a winter of plenty. Edmund watched them store their grain in structures with gaps in the walls, with dirt floors, with no lime wash or cedar lining or any of the protections that a lifetime of milling had taught him were essential. He said nothing. He had learned that warnings were useless when prosperity made people deaf. The Weevils arrived in August of 1886. No one knew exactly how they came. Perhaps a shipment of infested seed corn from a supplier in Missouri. Perhaps a freight wagon that had carried contaminated grain from the South. Perhaps they had been present all along, in small numbers, waiting for the abundance that would allow them to multiply into a plague. However they arrived, they found in Harrowfield a paradise. Thousands of pounds of grain stored in conditions that might have been designed to attract them. The infestation spread with terrifying speed. Weevils bred rapidly in warm, moist conditions, and the summer of 1886 provided both in abundance. A single female could lay 300 eggs in a season, and each larva burrowed into a kernel of grain, consuming it from within, emerging as an adult to breed again. The generations compounded. What began as a few insects in a corner of Pritchard's warehouse became, within weeks, a crawling mass that consumed everything it touched. Pritchard discovered the disaster in early September. He had gone to his warehouse to fill an order for a customer in Salina and found the grain alive with movement. The wheat he scooped into his measuring bucket was riddled with holes, the kernels light as paper, the contents devoured. He checked bin after bin, sack after sack, and found the same destruction everywhere. 40,000 pounds of grain, the harvest of a dozen farms, ruined. The panic spread faster than the Weevils. Farmers raced to check their own stores and found the same horror waiting. The Hoffmans, the Lundgrens, the Murphys, every family that had stored grain in their barns and cellars discovered that the Weevils had found them too. The infestation was everywhere, in every structure, in every container that had not been properly sealed and treated. By October, the scope of the catastrophe was clear. Harrowfield had lost 90% of its stored grain. There was not enough left to eat through the winter, let alone to plant in the spring. The prosperity that had seemed so secure just 2 months before had been transformed into famine. Mayor Jessup called an emergency meeting at the church. The farmers of Harrowfield gathered with the hollow expressions of people who have just watched everything they worked for disappear. Pritchard was there, his lean face gray with shock, his calculating eyes for once betraying real fear. The women held their children close. The men stood with their hands clenched at their sides, struggling with a helplessness they did not know how to name. "We have perhaps 2,000 pounds of salvageable grain in the entire settlement," Jessup announced, his jovial manner extinguished. "That will feed us for perhaps 6 weeks if we ration strictly. After that," he spread his hands. "I don't know. I simply don't know." A voice spoke from the back of the church. I have grain. Every head turned. Edmund Vickers stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands, his expression unreadable. My silo holds 12,000 pounds, he said. Clean, dry, untouched by weevils. I checked it this morning. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Pritchard's voice cut through it, sharp with disbelief. Untouched? How is that possible? The weevils are everywhere. Not in my silo, Edmund said. My methods prevent infestation, sealed construction, cedar lining, lime wash, elevated foundation. The techniques have been known for centuries. I built my silo to use them. You did not. He walked to the front of the church, the congregation parting before him like water before a plow. 12,000 pounds will not feed this settlement through the winter, he continued. But it will keep us alive until help can arrive, and it will provide seed for the spring planting if we're careful. He looked around the room. I'm offering to share it, all of it, not to sell, to share. We'll ration together, survive together, plant together in the spring. Mayor Jessup found his voice. Mr. Vickers, we laughed at you. We called your silo foolishness. We said you were paranoid, building for a threat that didn't exist. The threat existed, Edmund said quietly. You simply chose not to see it. Why would you help us, after how we treated you? Edmund was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of memory. My father was a miller in Pennsylvania. In 1878, Weevils destroyed half the stored grain in our county. The mills that followed proper methods, his mill, survived. The farms that didn't lost everything. I watched children go hungry that winter. I watched families break apart, sell their land, move away with nothing. I swore then that if I ever had the means to prevent such a disaster, I would. He gestured toward the east, toward the hill where his silo stood. I built that silo for this moment, not for myself. I could have stored my own grain in a structure a tenth the size. I built it for you, for whoever needed it, whenever that need arose. The confession broke something in the room. Women began to weep. Men who had mocked Edmund's silo stared at the floor, unable to meet his eyes. Pritchard, whose warehouse had failed catastrophically, whose business model had been built on the assumption that farmers needed him, sat down heavily as if his legs could no longer support him. The distribution began the next day. Edmund established a rationing system based on family size, with children receiving priority. Each household received enough grain for 2 weeks, then returned for more. He kept meticulous records, ensuring that everyone received their fair share, that no family went hungry while others hoarded. He also began teaching. In the long evenings, when the work of distribution was done, he gathered whoever would listen and explain the methods that had saved his grain. Sealed construction, cedar lining, lime wash, proper drying, elevated foundations. The techniques were not complicated, but they required care and consistency, qualities that the rush to store grain quickly and cheaply had sacrificed. The weevils didn't destroy your grain because you were unlucky, he told them. They destroyed it because your storage methods invited them. Build properly, and this never happens again. The farmers listened. They had no choice now but to listen. Aldous Pritchard came to Edmund's farm on a November morning, his lean frame thinner than it had been, his calculating eyes holding something they had never held before. Humility. I told people your silo was foolishness, he said. I called it a cathedral to paranoia. I made sure farmers knew their credit would suffer if they stored grain with you. I know, Edmund said. I was protecting my business. If farmers could store grain safely without my warehouse, they wouldn't need me. I know that too. Pritchard's jaw tightened. My warehouse is empty now, contaminated. Even if I had grain to store, no one would trust me to keep it safe. My business is finished. Edmund said nothing. I came to ask. Pritchard stopped, struggled, forced himself to continue. I came to ask if you would teach me your methods, your techniques. I have nothing left to offer except my labor and my willingness to learn. Edmund studied the man who had been his chief antagonist for 3 years. The merchant who had organized the mockery, who had used economic pressure to isolate him, who had built his prosperity on the vulnerability of others. I'll teach anyone who wants to learn, Edmund said finally, including you. But understand something. These methods only work if everyone uses them. If you rebuild your warehouse with proper construction, but the farms that supply you don't change their practices, the Weevils will come back. This has to be a community effort, or it's nothing. Pritchard nodded slowly. I understand. Then we start tomorrow. Bring anyone who wants to learn. We have a lot of silos to build before next harvest. Thank you for watching this story about Edmund Vickers and the grain silo of Harrowfield. When we mock the cautious, we often find ourselves dependent on their foresight. If this story reminded you that proper preparation is never excessive when disaster arrives, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Wild West Retribution for more stories of frontier resilience and quiet vindication. Tell us in the comments, has anyone ever called your preparations paranoid until the day they proved essential? The winter of 1886 to 87 was lean but survivable. Edmund's 12,000 pounds, carefully rationed, kept Harrowfield alive until a relief shipment arrived by rail in late February. The grain that remained was reserved for spring planting, and every kernel was treated as precious because it was. That spring, 17 new grain storage structures were built across the settlement, each one following Edmund's specifications. Cedar-lined walls, lime-washed interiors, elevated foundations, sealed construction. The farmers who had mocked the grain cathedral now built smaller versions of their own, understanding at last that the investment in proper storage was not paranoia, but prudence. Aldous Pritchard rebuilt his warehouse according to Edmund's design. It took him 2 years and most of his remaining savings, but when it was finished, it was the finest grain storage facility in the county. He never again lost a single pound to Weevils. He also never again extended credit with the expectation that farmers had no other options. The community had learned to provide for itself. Mayor Jessup proposed a resolution naming Edmund Vickers the official grain storage advisor for Harrowfield. Edmund declined the title but accepted the responsibility, inspecting new construction, advising on methods, training the next generation of farmers in techniques that should never have been forgotten. The phrase "building a Vickers" entered the vocabulary of the Kansas plains. It meant constructing something right the first time, even if the cost was higher and the work was harder. It meant preparing for threats that others dismissed as unlikely. It was spoken with quiet respect, as if the speaker understood something about foresight that could only be learned through hunger. Edmund Vickers lived on his farm for another 31 years, passing in the spring of 1917 at the age of 72. He never married, but he was rarely alone. His expertise was sought throughout the territory, and visitors were constant. He trained over 200 farmers in proper grain storage during his lifetime, and the methods he taught spread across the state and beyond. His silo still stands. The cedar lining has been replaced twice, and the lime wash is renewed each spring. But the limestone foundation is original, the same stones that Edmund hauled from the quarry 35 years before his death. The Harrowfield Historical Society maintains it now, offering tours to school groups and farming families who want to understand how their great-grandparents survived. Above the door, carved in Edmund's own hand, sometime in the years after the Weevil disaster, is an inscription that visitors often photograph. Build for the worst, hope for the best, feed whoever comes. His father Cornelius, who had taught him that the enemies of grain were patient and relentless, would have recognized the wisdom in every word.